My name is Holly. I'm the communications director here at Therapsil. I am zooming in today from Toronto, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'd also like to do a quick land acknowledgement and acknowledge that I'm conducting this Zoom on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. But this land, now called Toronto, is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. For those of you who are new to Therapsil, I'll give you a really brief overview of who we are and what we do. We are a small Canadian nonprofit. We advocate for the medical legalization and therapeutic legalization of psilocybin for medical and therapeutic purposes. We were founded in 2019, and we have so far helped 55 individuals, 55 Canadian patients access legal psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy through Section 56 exemptions. That is our number as of yesterday morning when the 55th exemption came through, so very excited for that person. We also train healthcare practitioners in how to facilitate this treatment option for approved patients. We have so far launched 10 training cohorts all across the country, and we've announced 7 more that will be rolling out this year, likely many more to come. And this is our first webinar of the year. We will be doing monthly webinars, January to December of 2022. They'll be on the 3rd Wednesday of every month. And if you've registered for this one, you are automatically registered for the rest of them. So we hope to see you throughout the year. And for those of you who signed up for this but have no idea what we're going to be talking about today, the purpose of this webinar is really to have an exploratory discussion about the recent changes to Canada's Special Access Program and how it compares to the current exemption process that patients are getting access to psilocybin through, or psilocybin therapy through, and talk a little bit about how this affects patients and healthcare professionals, and how folks can actually access psilocybin or psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy in Canada today. We have an awesome panel, so I'm just going to ask everybody on our panel to introduce yourself. And Thomas, why don't we start with you?
I am Thomas Hartle. I'm a cancer patient from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I was one of the first 4 Canadians to receive a Section 56 exemption for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And now we're looking into the SAP program.
Thanks, Thomas. Val, why don't you go ahead?
I'm Valerie Masuda. I'm a palliative care physician. I'm also a clinical associate clinical professor of medicine at University of British Columbia. I am on the board of directors at Therapsil, and I'm also on the board of directors of My Community Journeys, which is another nonprofit where we've actually delivered group psilocybin treatment for those with Section 56 exemptions to great success. Currently my practice is in palliative care.
Phenomenal. Thanks, Val. Jag, why don't you go ahead?
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jagbal. I also go by Jag as well. I'm an assistant professor at UBC's Faculty of Pharmacy, and I am the clinical pharmacist with Therapsil, leading the psilocybin pharmacology and therapeutics training module. My specialties include mental health and addictions, and I've worked within the psychedelic world for over a decade through a harm reduction lens to ensure clients' medications and medical conditions are not affected by personal use. I'm a vocal advocate for moving away from drug exceptionalism and drug prohibition.
Thank you, Jag. So happy you're here. Spencer, what about yourself?
Ollie. Yep, my name is Spencer Hoxwa. I'm a patient rights advocate and the CEO at Therapsil.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, David.
Hi, yeah, thank you. My name is David Wood. I'm a lawyer and patent agent. I have 12 years of experience, and my work is entirely in psychedelics and cannabis. I split my time between an in-house position at Cygen Industries, which is a licensed dealer. We're licensed to sell and manufacture LSD and 6 other controlled substances. And I also give advice to clients, including Therapsil, outside of that. And all the work I do for Therapsil is pro bono.
Thanks, David. We appreciate you very much. And quick disclaimer before we get into the discussion, just want to say the information that we'll be talking about today and that is presented, it's only part of our learning series for educational purposes. This is not medical or legal advice. So it's not legal or medical advice. And with that said, I just want to get into the discussion. So Jag, why don't you start us off? Could you tell us a little bit about what is the Special Access Program?
Perfect, thank you. So I've actually co-written several successful special access program application requests for non-psychedelic medications because I work in HIV and I've worked in oncology as well. The Special Access Program, or SAP, because it rolls off the tongue easier, exists as a less political length stream of Health Canada and allows for licensed healthcare professionals with prescribing authority. And this can vary from province to province, but typically includes medical physicians and nurse practitioners to request access to medications, devices, and substances that are not currently approved by Health Canada. So these products essentially become exempt from the Food and Drugs regulation for that single application that you're making. And all approvals come down to the rationale that's provided by both the prescriber and the care teams involved in the patient care. So typically the products being requested are investigational new drugs, so typically being studied in clinical trials that are usually at the phase 2 or higher mark. Or are products that have been approved for use in other countries and are just not marketed in Canada for whatever reason. Oftentimes, they have to be imported into Canada unless there's a Canadian research manufacturing company that produces them in-house. And we know that our national pharmaceutical production is not the greatest, so we tend to have to import quite a bit. This in-country production is actually much easier, especially in the context of controlled drugs like psilocybin, which will require an additional layer of being compliant with the Controlled Drug Regulations Act, which can require a dealer's license and a lot of other red tape to pass. Now, the value of having special access program as another stream is that it provides a safe supply route. So the prescribers and the care teams seek out standardized product, and it increases the collection of efficacy data, so how effective the medication is, and safety data. So it really adds to the evidence base that we are wanting through what we call pharmacovigilance, which is just a really big word, essentially monitoring safety signals and outcomes of intervention. So just making sure it works and how well it works. Requests are typically processed within 1 to 2 business days, but these are for established medical conditions that have had multiple SAP requests. So new ones like psychedelics may have a longer turnaround time, but essentially shouldn't be too long because they're meant for emergent needs as well. Now, it's important to note that this is not a pathway to legalization or decriminalization and does not replace the need and requirement for clinical trials, which is the official channel for Health Canada eventual approval and regulation and all that. The Special Authority Program is for serious and critical or emergency treatment use and is not intended for broad access to medications or drugs.
Awesome. Thanks, Jag. That was very comprehensive, and we'll get back to what does serious or emergency use mean in just a little bit. But we mentioned at the top of this webinar, there were recent changes to the Special Access Program in Canada. And David, I'm wondering if you can let us know, what are these changes mean as it relates to psychedelics, specifically psilocybin?
So the changes were that in Canada, we have a Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. There are a number of schedules, 4 schedules that have controlled substances in them. There are other schedules that have precursors or are empty. The first 4 schedules, though, have controlled substances. They don't track the way the American Schedule 1, Schedule 2 concept does. They're just in there in 4 different schedules. Regulations under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act break controlled substances into 4 categories: narcotics, controlled drugs, targeted substances, and restricted drugs. Restricted drugs is the closest analogy in Canada to Schedule 1 in the United States. Restricted drugs have no medical recognized application, and most of what we'd call psychedelics are in that schedule. LSD's in that schedule, psilocybin and MDMA are in that schedule, as are pretty much any drug people call psychedelics. So that schedule lists those drugs. The Food and Drug Regulations used to prohibit accessing any restricted drug through the Special Access Program. as of January 5th this year, that prohibition has been removed. So now being a restricted drug doesn't mean ineligible for access through the special access program. Not anymore. However, as Jag pointed out, like was if you really reflect on what she said, and there's a lot of content there. I'd recommend people revisit that and listen to it very slowly, because that was a very dense, very effective summary of how the SAP works. So it's not really, it's designed for drug products that are already approved or are late stage trials. So products that are made a certain way all the time in a licensed facility to GMP standards and in compliance with what in Canada would be a drug establishment license. So that's what it's designed for. That means that things like the products made by Compass or USONA or MAPS Public Benefit Corp for MDMA, the first two for psilocybin, those would be the simplest analogy to what we're used to with the special access program. That's the easiest example. That's the most on script. It would be using one of those close to market approval drug products that have a restricted drug as the active pharmaceutical ingredient, using those using them in a patient through special access and using them on label. And then anything that departs from that is going into territory for which the special access program was not designed, but that the law allows. So it's going to be interesting to see how the regulator, Health Canada, Therapeutic Products Directorate, I believe it would be I don't know what department within that, but they would decide each application on its merits. And I'm curious whether with psychedelics, where in most cases we're accelerating the effectiveness of psychotherapy, using that term, maybe therapy delivered by a professional, where it's that context, maybe the closeness of the material being requested in the special access program to a drug that's been trialed, maybe it matters in a different way than when you're shrinking tumors or treating HIV, right? Like, as long as we're getting to the result that psychotherapy is in fact advanced and that there is a life-threatening situation like treatment-resistant depression, or where other treatments have failed, which happens frequently in mental health issues like this, then maybe the regulator will be a little broader than the default kind of example one version of special access. Maybe it will be okay to go outside of the products that weren't trialed where there is data, provided that it's a materially similar product, because we are, after all, talking about an oral dosage of drugs that are used every day in completely irresponsible circumstances with other drugs, and yet you still don't see the toxicology of psilocybin and MDMA is known to be very, very low. And if the dose is known, I think the safety of these drugs is pretty well established. And then if it gets to how much efficacy and how specific does the efficacy data have to be, I'm just, again, very curious if we see maybe a bit more flexibility from the regulator than we'd see with a chemotherapy drug, or a drug where, the therapeutic index is much narrower than with psilocybin, where it's virtually impossible to have a toxic overdose as long as you know how much you're taking.
Nice. Thanks, David. Spencer, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about a patient accessing psilocybin through the Section 56 process, which is what we've been doing for the past 18 months, and now what that would look like through the SAP, and compare and contrast those two systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll first just start off with what some of maybe the improvements to this process have been and what the major differences are. So over the past 18 months, just about every Section 56 application that we've sent through has taken quite a bit of time. And so time has been one of the biggest issues for many patients and healthcare practitioners. I'm sure that everyone can imagine that, an exemption taking up to 6 months is a long time for someone with a terminal diagnosis. And in, unfortunately, a couple cases, it was too long. So timing is a major issue, and the SAP does seem to have a service delivery standard, which is about, I think, 48 hours on requests that have been processed before. what's that going to take the first time through? We're not exactly sure, but we'll be testing it. So that's definitely, looking up for a number of patients who have been waiting, a long time, because many of them, even after, they've gotten their first exemption, and this is a bit of a hint at some people who have gotten an exemption that expired in a year and then had to reapply, even on the reapplication. So someone who has a past precedent of getting it is waiting months and months, and that's kind of unacceptable. So this is definitely going to help with timing, and we're very excited about that for sure. Another one is safety too. So every exemption over the past 18 months has been granted. Patients have had to find their own access to supply, and this has been the government mainly just staying silent on it and turning a bit of a blind eye. And while we have been asking for safe supply, much of the reason we couldn't is because of these amendments that were made to the SAP back in 2013 that have since changed. So now there is SAP access. So if we can get patients access to either some of the products that David had mentioned, or to one of the many psilocybin molecules or substances that are being produced by companies here in Canada. I hear that there are some synthetics. Many people are growing mushrooms too, and there are also natural extracts. And I think what's important to note here is that we've got a wide variety of patients, for many of whom have had experience with certain mushrooms and certain strains and certain amounts, and that's what works for them. And many doctors and patients that also would rather have one over the other. So being able to have options for patients is important. It's something we saw in cannabis. You can't just give people one option. There should be multiple options. So it'll be exciting to flesh that out and see what options are available for Canadians. And I also think, as Jag mentioned, Canada isn't exactly the strongest for having in-country pharmaceuticals and drug development. When we should capitalize on that. We should make sure that we're self-reliant on our own access. So if there are Canadian psilocybin producers, that's fantastic. And in this case, it looks like we'll be able to get that to patients. So safety, timing, both of those are fantastic. However, I would say perhaps the most important thing that this does not solve for is transparency. So it was also mentioned before that this process is a bit less political than Section 56. It's not necessarily in the hands of the Minister of Health. And in some ways, that's good. In other ways, it's bad, because the patients and therapists, doctors at Therapsil have had a really good friend in the Minister of Health, Patty Hajdu, and now our new Ministers of Health, Carolyn Bennett and Jean-Yves Duclos. Those ministers have been able to step up and make a compassionate decision when things are taking too long or when they're not getting passed. And it puts a reasonable decision in the hands of a reasonable person. Sometimes it's a bit bogged down in the bureaucracy when it is bureaucrats going through a process, and it can take too long, and it may not necessarily be the best decision for that patient. Again, it's hard to say, but I call that transparency. We don't know how those decisions are being made, and what we advocate for here is that decision should be in the hands of a patient and doctor. A doctor should be acting as the gatekeeper. It's the doctor who's going to know when something like psilocybin might be a wise medical decision for a patient. So with all of that being said, we just got confirmation, I think 2 days ago, that the first exemption since the SAP changes, so the first Section 56 exemption has come through, which is a good signal to us that Section 56 will continue to operate, because for many patients, that is the best route to get access. It's predictable. It may not be very fast, may not be very safe and transparent, but it works for them. So that may work. And then for other patients, we'll definitely be exploring SAP. And certainly that's going to apply most to the patients who we understand meet the criteria. So those who need emergency access, those who are at end of life and perhaps meet the criteria of treatment-resistant mental illness, like treatment-resistant depression. But if they're outside of that, it may be necessary to use Section 56 so that we can put those cases not to a standardized system where bureaucrats are making decisions, but one to where we have a compassionate Minister of Health who can look at a certain person, their situation, and apply a fair judgment on whether or not they should be accessing psilocybin. And so our hope is that those two systems may actually work together, and we may be able to set some precedents, because if a patient is able to get access through Section 56, I think it would only make sense that the SAP should accommodate to ensure that their supply of psilocybin is safe. So those are really the two primary differences. And I think to answer the questions that we've been getting most, both through Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, and email, is, what's the best way forward? And the answer to that is both. We'll start off with both. And I think either today or tomorrow, we'll be sending our first SAP, truly testing it now that we have some information, or the necessary information, from patients, doctors, and drug producers.
Nice. Thanks, Spencer. That's a good compare and contrast, pros and cons. Thomas, from a patient perspective, you, as you mentioned, one of the first 4 Canadians to ever get access to psilocybin. And I shouldn't really say access to psilocybin through Section 56, because you didn't get access to the drug. You're allowed to use and possess and transport and destroy a certain amount of psilocybin for medical purposes. Now, knowing that there's this SAP process, what is your perspective on that as a patient? How does this change things for you?
Well, there's a couple of things that I think are probably relevant from a patient perspective. Number one is the primary difference between the Section 56 and the SAP for me is, with the Section 56, it's really discussing my medical issues with bureaucrats and having a bureaucrat decide whether or not I am able to access this particular therapy. Whereas with the SAP, this now is closer to what I would really prefer as a solution, where I'm discussing my medical issues with a medical doctor who can then determine whether this is the proper course of treatment for me or not. So again, that's it's nice to have the idea that there will be a system where my dirty laundry in terms of medical conditions is going to be kept between somebody who is somebody I consider confidential with my medical information, whereas a public bureaucratic official, while they're certainly doing a good job with processing the applications, I wouldn't necessarily consider them to be people that I would like to discuss my medical history with if I did not absolutely have to. Now, the other difference that I see here is with the Section 56, as you said, Holly, that doesn't actually give me access to the medication itself. So in my particular instance, I had to grow my own mushrooms. For other people, I believe that there were some dispensaries that are, while not legal, they were providing mushrooms, but that doesn't guarantee the content of those mushrooms, and it doesn't guarantee the efficacy or concentrations or anything like that. So I like the idea that the SAP is going to be able to provide a safe, consistent, evenly dosed product where we can get a consistent input and a predictable result out of it from one treatment to the next.
Nice. Thanks, Thomas. And I think Spencer was alluding to this earlier. And yes, while with the Section 56, you're not talking, you are talking directly to the Minister of Health, and there's no kind of middleman of a physician there, where that is the case with the SAP. At the end of the day, the person making a decision on whether or not a patient gets access is still at a governmental level. So it's not, your healthcare provider, the person who knows everything about you from a healthcare perspective, ideally, saying, yes, after consulting with you and looking at all of the treatment options, I have the power to say that you can have access to this. It's somebody who is, quite frankly, sitting in a government office somewhere and reading an application form, not your physician or nurse practitioner. So there is that government as gatekeeper problem that still exists. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Yeah, go ahead.
One other point I was going to make, and Spencer had mentioned the length of time that it takes for the approval on these applications. So my initial Section 56 was approved after 106 days. My application has, of course, expired because that was back in the summer of 2020. And my renewal application has actually taken almost 4 months now. So I have been, waiting for approximately 7 months for the approvals for Section 56s to take place, which quite literally, as you say, for a terminal illness, for many people is the rest of your life waiting.
Yeah.
So if we can get the approvals for these SAPs in a much more timely fashion, then I think ultimately that's going to benefit people very much.
Absolutely. That standard service time of 1 to 2 business days, as said by Health Canada themselves, that is very encouraging. And so for folks who are in a serious illness or emergency situation, like that's way better than the Section 56 process. Val, what, from a healthcare professional perspective, how does this change things for you? Is this easier, better? What do you think?
I think it's going to actually depend on how that first SAP for psilocybin goes through. I found that having conversations with Health Canada, the clerks or the bureaucrats that were making decisions really had no clinical knowledge or expertise in either mental health, existential distress, cancer, or the use of psilocybin and the safety and efficacy profiles of psilocybin. So it was very, very difficult to actually have a conversation with these people. I found with our Section 56 applications, a lot of the Health Canada responses were really, I see it as delaying, just delaying responses. So, you get a letter back saying, give us more information about X. And you're really thinking, well, I'm as a physician, this is medical information that is not necessarily my right to disclose to a clerk in a government office who really is not making clinical decisions based on any information about the patient or the medication itself. So it became exercise of just frustration because we knew that these were decisions that were being made purely politically. The SAP, looking at the application process, I think it's going to be a huge barrier. The reason why is that the physician that's putting in the application really has to be somebody who's using psilocybin, who is giving psilocybin based psychotherapy, or at least working with the therapist who's giving psilocybin based psychotherapy. So this isn't going to be your average family doctor who is now taking responsibility for acquiring this medication and delivering it to the patient or administering it to the patient. So access to providers is going to be difficult. Access to people who are willing to go through the form and actually put down drug doses. I mean, as a medical professional, I could be pretty certain that this is a prescription. So if I'm writing if I'm writing a prescription for a certain dosage to be given in a certain way, I should have a pretty strong understanding about the pharmacology, the risks, the benefits, and the indications and contraindications. So I think most family doctors will have a really, problems with feeling that they are competent in writing these SAPs, as well as finding somebody to write down on that form who is going to be receiving the SAP. And it's either a healthcare provider's office or, a community pharmacy or blood bank, or, so it's actually those people who would be delivering or just not only dispensing to the patient, but probably administering the medication to the patient as well. So I think it's going to be a significant barrier, and we'll see about getting the first SAP in, what the turnaround time is. Right now, Cygen has product. We've been looking for a number of different producers to see if they have product and if they have license to what is it, David? What it's called? A license to dispense and a license to produce.
Like a dealer's license.
Like a dealer's license, exactly. So finding people that do have a dealer's license, finding people who have a product that the patient is comfortable with, synthetic or extract or or powder or dried mushroom, and finding somebody who actually has product available, because that is another barrier right now. So I think with the SAPs, there's, yes, patients can access safe product, but the barriers to getting an SAP application actually filled out and sent to Health Canada is a big difference. With the Section 56, it was a patient application. The patients were basically forming their case with a letter, and the practitioners were basically saying, sure, I'm good with that. They could try this, not much to lose. So this is a very, very different process.
Thanks, Val. It'll be very interesting to see, like you said, once you submit the first one, what Health Canada comes back with. What I found interesting reading some of the literature is with the Section 56 process, there doesn't seem to be a clear process in terms of once something is submitted, what they do with that information. Whereas with the SAP, they can either approve the request form, they can deny the request form, they can say this request form is incomplete, we need X, Y, and Z information. They can, with the prescribing physician can withdraw the request form and say, actually, my patient doesn't need it anymore. Or Health Canada can cancel the request form and say, the manufacturer you requested, they actually don't have those drugs, or they can't supply what you've asked for.
Just one more point is that a physician or a nurse practitioner or whoever who has filled out the SAP is required actually to fill out a second form to submit to Health Canada about when the substance was ingested, how much, and what the adverse effects were and the benefits. So again, this is another barrier to your average family doctor, taking this SAP form and kind of dealing with it. So I really see this as a huge barrier for general patient access.
And I mean, I don't think that's a mistake on Health Canada's part. They were pretty clear in their announcement in the Canada Gazette that this is not for broad access. It is for emergency use only. So with that said, Jag, with an assist from Val, I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about what does that request form look like? What kind of clinical rationale does a healthcare professional need to provide in order to access psilocybin or another psychedelic through this program?
Yeah, good question there. So Val's kind of laid out the documentation burden on there. And so I can just kind of expand a little bit more in terms of what that documentation burden is. So essentially, it's an 8-page document, depending on the type of form you're requesting, whether it's for urgent individual use or whether it's for use in the future, which likely wouldn't fall within the psychedelic kind of applications. I would assume the majority of them will fall within the individual immediate use. So I think that's Form A. And for that, typically you would have to provide relevant clinical information on the patient's current medical condition, which is the current medical condition that you're requesting the application for, past medical history, comorbidity, so any coexisting medical conditions that the patient has. And then specifically, it needs to be requested, what is it about this medication, whether it's the mechanism of action, the pharmacology, the class, the route of administration, perhaps, that makes it the best choice for your patient. So typically that involves, ruling out other medications that are part of guideline directed care. So if we have, first line agents, second line agents, third line agents, patients have tried them, all the medications would have to be listed. The duration of those medications would have to be listed, the results of those medications. So whether it was failure because of side effects, whether the medications that are part of guideline directed care didn't help the medical condition. So basically as much rationale as you can provide in terms of the existing treatment guidelines for that medical condition in terms of why they don't apply. And then including information on the product that you're requesting. So in this case, we'll talk about psilocybin. So basically recent and relevant data regarding psilocybin. And typically you want to make sure that the resources or the references that you're attaching are related to the medical condition you're wanting to request a psilocybin for. And as we know, a lot of the evidence currently is in the field of treatment-resistant depression, PTSD. So you would have to make sure that your patient's indication would fall within kind of the current popular researched medical condition model. So if it's for a condition that doesn't have, phase 2 evidence, or at least phase 1 feasibility evidence, it'd be very unlikely that you would get approval for it, because you would have to have documented safety and efficacy data. And that's usually brought forward at the phase 2 clinical trial drug level. So once you've determined that the medical condition does have supporting resources, you want to make sure that they're included, they're referenced. You're basically essentially making a care plan for a patient. So if any healthcare workers are in here, you remember from your training programs, you had to make a lot of care plans, properly referenced and all that. That's essentially what it requires. So it can actually become quite lengthy, especially if it's for for a product that doesn't have approved indications, and that they're currently in investigational drug status. You would have to have a considerable amount of safety and efficacy data for that. And it would have to kind of match your patient population as well, making sure that your patient's parameters kind of fit within the participant pools that the trials also included from as well. So basically, like I mentioned, it's just as exact to the medical condition references that you can find would be it. So that's the biggest burden. And as Val mentioned, there's also the post administration follow-up form that you have to do. And that's part of that word that I use, pharmacovigilance, which is actually really important in healthcare. It will include outcome data, safety data, time and date of administration. And so that Health Canada can also make sure that it was administered and when it was, so that there's proper record keeping, but also add to the evidence base. And so if there's a lot of positive outcomes from our SAP applications, then it can potentially inform future applications to go quicker and all that. So the more referenced the initial few SAP applications are with a good, strong body of evidence, then I think future applications will go through much quicker. As I mentioned, typically the turnaround time is 1 to 2 days, for business days for application submission to application answer. And that's for medical conditions that have had prior SAP. So if we get that kind of system in place with the first few applications we do, then the turnaround time will be very similar. I don't anticipate it being like 2-3 weeks turnaround. I'm just spitballing here, but I'm assuming a week would be the biggest turnaround time. And Val, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, just that currently there's a fair bit of evidence, sort of class 2 level evidence for the use of psilocybin for end-of-life existential distress. And this is where all the Section 56s have been granted, except more recently, a couple have been granted in patients who have a case for not end-of-life existential distress. Certainly with the MDMA, there is more level 3 body of evidence now just released in 2021. So I think that's where this is kind of rolling out. But certainly if you have, even though there may be some evidence, sort of a level 2 study on things like treatment of cluster headaches or some for substance use disorder patients. I mean, the body of evidence isn't that robust. So that's where I think we're going to first try with the end-of-life existential distress, because the evidence is much more robust. And then from there, look at how we're going to roll this out if we get approval with the SAP.
Yeah, and that's a good point as well, because there are case reports or smaller studies, very small participant pools that are published as well. So you could try applications with those, but it's not going to be the strongest grade of evidence for the first few initial, at least, applications, I would say. High quality, high grade, high participant pool, or good outcome data would be the ones that you'd want to reference for sure as much as possible.
Great, thanks you two. So what I'm hearing, and from my discussions with you all, it would make it easier for Health Canada to approve an application if you were saying my patient with X condition wants to use X drug that has this clinical data for this drug for this condition.
Exactly.
When you start mixing and matching everything, you might be stretching Health Canada a little bit more to say, like, yes, this makes sense, or no, it doesn't. And I know a question that's come up a lot, and a lot of folks on the call probably want to know what is a serious condition, or what is an emergency condition? David, do you want to talk to that? Jag, Val, Thomas, Spencer?
Generally, it's considered, emergency is life and limb. So I need this medication because I have a life and limb condition, threatening condition, and I need this. So this is why terminal cancer patients have the best option for this particular treatment, because there is a time limitation. I have had a patient who was waiting for a Section 56 exemption and died before they managed to get this exemption. So I think, making the case that these are terminal illness patients with life limitation puts them into that level of urgency. And certainly we do not want to give psilocybin treatment to people who are nearly dying or in their dying time. We want to give it to people who have a symptom. It's like pain. We don't want to wait until the end of life to give somebody something for pain. This is a different kind of pain. It's very much a serious type of pain, which has impacts on longevity and impacts certainly on quality of life. And so we can make a case for that. We can say that, this is actually limiting the patient's quality of life and potentially their duration of living. So, and this medication is safe, has good efficacy, we could prove, and therefore this is where our application is going. So I think this is our best bet.
Yeah,
And
I think
I can add to that too, is that, this is compassionate access, or Section 56 is based on compassionate grounds, right? Not necessarily evidence. So something we have to weigh with what Val just said, right, is, yes, there are patients who may meet this test for, are they, is it emergency use? And Health Canada has given us some guidelines. They've said that treatment-resistant depression, right, is emergency use. But then, we start asking ourselves, what about, patients who are struggling with opioids, who are currently using psilocybin to manage cravings, right? Like how many relapses do you need before, before there are no more relapses, right? Because it's incredibly dangerous. And the same goes for patients with suicidal ideations, right? So all of a sudden, this request for compassionate access now meets this test for, is there any evidence to suggest that psilocybin will help this? And that's where there's a bit of gray area. So we're going to do our best job to test that and to try and set some precedents as best we can, and where I think we're going to continue to have a friend in the ministers of health.
Thank you, everyone.
So I interrupted you there.
Oh, no, I was actually going to mention the exact same thing about the treatment-resistant depression and treatment-resistant illness would be classified as an urgent medical need for potential application for SAP, and especially with the body of evidence that we have for treatment-resistant depression, I think would be a valid indication to start the initial SAP processes, because we have large participant pool data that's at phase 2B and soon to be phase 3 in 2022 publication. So I think, there's a huge need, especially, amongst this pandemic and everything that we've seen in terms of mental health care, that treatment-resistant depression should also be one of the streams that we follow as well.
Thank you very much. I completely agree. There's a lot of mental health conditions and regular health conditions that we hope the government will consider serious, because it is very serious for the patients who are firsthand experiencing their symptoms and conditions. So I'm a stickler for time. If you've been around Therapsil for a while, and I like to end webinars on time. So we have 15 minutes left, and 24 questions. So I'm going to do our best to just whip through these. If we can keep answers as concise as possible, that would be great. For any questions that we don't get to, you may be aware that our team is currently working on a white paper to hopefully answer as many questions as we can with the information that we have, and we'll update that white paper as we continue to go through this process and better understand the special access program. So if we don't answer your question now, we will get to it on social media and or on our white paper. So stay tuned, and thank you for your patience. First question, can a doctor bill a patient, or I guess the health authority, to fill out this SAP form? Is there a billing code for that?
All forms that physicians fill out are billed directly to the patient, and the longer the form fill, the higher the cost to the patient.
Okay. Thank you, Val. Spencer, are we planning to submit any SAP requests? What are the logistics around when we can help people?
Yeah, so I think, as I just briefly mentioned, we've got our first one going out hopefully either today or tomorrow, and we'll be testing this. So as information becomes available, that's what therapsil does, is we support patients to getting access to psilocybin. So we'll be there to determine what the best course of action is based on what evidence we have, and what looks like the easiest way to get them, or the safest way to get them psilocybin. So I think most likely it will become part of that, and hopefully that means we'll be able to educate quite a few doctors on how to do that themselves.
Awesome. And I'll just stipulate that we are a very small nonprofit with very limited resources. So please bear with us as we navigate this process so that we can best help as many people. If you do want to help us speed up that process, we are always accepting donations. That does help us do our work faster. Just a little plug for that. This one might be a little bit more complicated, but can an individual take psilocybin while on antidepressants? And I know there's some new research that just came out about this. So anybody want to touch that one?
So I can kind of touch on it a little bit. Again, this is not medical advice or anything like that, but there has been two studies that have been recently published that have shown that antidepressants do not affect the subjective and treatment effects of psilocybin. Now, these are in healthy individuals, so whether that really applies to all patient populations, we don't know. But the major concern with it is serotonin syndrome, and serotonin syndrome, there's really no safety signals that we can see that can exist with just antidepressants, so typically SSRIs and psilocybin, but it's very individual depending on the type of antidepressant, other medications that potentially could have effects on the serotonin pathway. But based on the two most recent studies that have been published, there's been no safety signals and no efficacy decrease in those individuals using psilocybin and antidepressants, specifically SSRIs.
Excellent news. Thanks, Jag. Not medical advice, but you heard it here first. As a counseling therapist in a private practice with appropriate training, who else does this person need to build into their team in order to make use of the special access program?
A relationship of some kind with a physician who understands the space would be critical.
I'm just going to make a plug for pharmacists. Pharmacists are amazing medication management people. And so those that are trained in psychopharmacology or psychedelics would be a really good fit to do the medication review and a lot of the form applications for SAPs.
Thank you. Do we know of any SAP approvals that have already happened? Have there been any public announcements about that? I haven't. No, there's a lot of hoopla in the media about psilocybin was just legalized. That is not the case. As you may have heard on this webinar, it's very specific. So we don't actually know of any approvals that have gone through, but there might have been, and they just haven't been made public, which is fair because it's, patient confidentiality. So who actually decides that a patient gets access or a request form is approved? Who is saying, yes, this request form is approved? Who's gatekeeping at the federal level?
So this is just from my previous SAPs that I've done. I don't know if it's changed or if this is going to change, but I believe it was the official was the deputy health minister. And I think that's where originally the SAPs were, and it was through like their therapeutics review committee or something like that. But I have a feeling it's changed since I looked into it too deeply.
Thank you. I also saw in some of the what's it called, information that I was looking at, that if an application is denied, there is you can request and you can appeal it. You can say, yeah, Jag, can you talk a little bit about that appeal process?
So I haven't actually had any appeals because all of ours were very specific, like they're for specific genetic mutations that you couldn't really say no to, or resistance patterns for HIV, patients living with HIV. But I'm assuming the denial process would be an appeals process where you would go through discussion with the group or perhaps the individuals that were on the committee that were approving that, and you can go into it in more depth. I think I've heard of one for another medical condition, but I haven't actually been a part of the process. I'm not sure, David, if you have any additional information on that.
I was not really, but I just want to underscore to the audience to remember that the SAP has been around for a long time, and it is the kind of default example is think cancer or HIV or other life-threatening, sometimes rare conditions. Cystic fibrosis, it's been used for cystic fibrosis. Drugs that have since been approved. Holly learned that and shared it with me. So that's what it's made for. It's made for drugs that are already approved and that are for a condition that is going to very likely kill the patient, and where the treatment is just, there may be other treatments for that condition, but they haven't helped that patient. Like, again, think rare cancers or HIV. But then the other thing I was curious about too is how far, well, I mean, it's basically what I said when I spoke earlier, how far outside of that example of it is approved, we're using it on label, is Health Canada going to go? And Jag, I'm just wondering if you've ever seen any approved that are off label.
So off-label, typically, like the only way that you consider off-label is if they have a notice of compliance with Health Canada because they're approved for a specific indication or anything like that. There have been one or two that I know that have been off-label from the approved indication in the country that we're importing from, but have been studied. Yeah, but have been studied in clinical trials for other indications. So like there's still a body of evidence for it. It's just not approved for that indication in the country that we're looking for, like for the regulatory data. So I would say if you're going off-label for psilocybin, you would still have to have a body of evidence that supports the safety and efficacy. And I always say safety first, because that's how Health Canada will work before the efficacy comes in play as well. So if you are using it for something that perhaps maybe has like a small feasibility study or some case reports or case studies published in good scientific journals, that potentially could be it. But I would say it's probably less likely because the body of evidence for treatment guidelines and guideline directed care would outnumber that. And they would have to have gone through the whole channels before they get to that off-label kind of thing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm getting a bit overwhelmed with the amount of questions, and I really hope that we can answer more of them. But I also want to open the floor to our panel and just say, do you have any final or closing statements about your personal or professional opinions about this new avenue, how it may affect you personally? So Thomas, I'd love to start with you. You haven't had a whole lot of time to talk on this panel. So, oh, you're on mute. There we go.
There we go. Sorry. My microphone is really sensitive, so I leave it off. For me, the timeframes involved here are really significant. Being a terminal cancer patient and being somebody that I think who represents other terminal cancer patients who are waiting, the timeframes for the approval process is a very significant factor. So, between the time frame and the safety of the supply, I think those are probably the main things that I think are most significant from my particular patient perspective.
Awesome. Thanks, Thomas. Those timeframes definitely are encouraging. So we're excited to see that work in real life and see if they can uphold the standard service time that they have said it is. Val, how are you feeling about this process? Any closing thoughts?
My thought is it's really unwieldy. I certainly will be, for my own patients, looking at doing a dual application with SAPs and Section 56. It would be interesting to see which one comes first. But again, for those that have a Section 56 exemption, they have no safe medication supply. So you really, and this is a problem. The other problem is that even the people that have a drug deal, the psilocybin dealership license, they're far and few between, and they can only release to clinical trials or through SAP. So we're still, accessibility for patients is still super limited.
Yeah, thanks, Val. We feel the same. Like, we really need a better system than this. Jag, what about you? Are you excited about this? How is this going to change your job as a pharmacist?
So I think like this, although there's a lot of restrictions and there's still a lot of inaccessibility issues, I think it's getting the conversation started. I know for myself, like I've been definitely discussing this with colleagues that were probably, new to psychedelics or new to understanding this, because now the word medical is being thrown in there. And so a lot of my healthcare practitioner colleagues, both physicians, nurse practitioners, pharmacists, naturopaths, like everyone who has seen this and are now interested in it, are starting to potentially get more information and hopefully be the advocates that we need for them to advocate to their own individual colleges to help propel this into more of a Health Canada approved stream for medical model, and eventually, for public access as well. And so for me, like I mentioned, like I am a proponent of moving away from exceptionalism in drug policy and prohibition in drug policy. I think this is really just getting those conversations started, and there may be some patients that benefit as well. So there's definitely a benefit there, but I think it's that broader discussions that's really feeding into it, and it's making me excited.
Awesome. Thanks, Jag. That's a really positive and good point. Is, a lot of people are now learning about this, maybe for the first time. So that's exciting that the word is getting out. Yeah. David, what about you? How are you feeling?
Yeah, no, I'm glad I'm going after Jag, because I agree that better policy on controlled substances in general is moving in the right direction. And with psilocybin, and I'd say other psychedelics specifically, it makes sense, I think, to move to a medical access system like the one Therapsil's advocating for, where products that are standardized, like cannabis products, with standard stuff, exist. But with psilocybin as the input, we have the infrastructure, we have the expertise, like in our government, and it can be done in a different way where there is more physician involvement, because of the way the colleges choose to execute on it, because the provincial colleges have a lot of power here too. The federal government can make something like this exist for psilocybin, and then the colleges can manage the circumstances under which their members can authorize access, and then more data can be had. And it can just be, we can execute in a more effective way than we did with medical cannabis, which I personally think helped a lot of people and was successful. But I've heard some physicians criticize it for being lack of focus on data, and we can correct that. But yeah, no, that's my main thing, is better access for the lowest possible cost to the public and to the regulator and to the insurance companies. And I think that's through medical access, not solely pharmaceuticals.
Phenomenal. Thank you, David. Spencer, why don't you wrap us up today?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've been kind of saying the same thing over multiple articles and days through calls. And I think it's the same thing here, that, this is a step in the right direction. But as far as the fact that, we've, almost everyone on this call and many other stakeholders. Hundreds of doctors and therapists and patients for the last 2 years have been seeking help and a response to the issue that we've had around supply, around who's making the decision, transparency and timing. And that after 2 years, this is all that's been done is a bit of a shame. So we're definitely calling on the health ministers and Health Canada to do more and to respond to the many people whom SAP does nothing for, and for the many disparities left in that policy. So it's policy, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's good policy or an accurate response to what's going on. And so the last thing I'll leave with here is one of the biggest problems I think that our group has agreed with is that this does nothing to support the healthcare practitioners that are involved in training right now. And we've got 130 healthcare practitioners. We just sent an open letter to Minister Duclos a couple of weeks ago, signed by over 200 doctors, nurses, and therapists, seeking responses to their exemptions for training and a move towards regulations, not just an SAP amendment. So realizing that even if there were regulations made tomorrow, or even if people are getting access through SAP, the government is not treating this like the drug therapy combination that it is, or in many cases that it is. And it's really important to realize that SAP is not an appropriate form of access, which they've admitted to. And I just want to repeat that it's not a long-term or an appropriate response to the need for psilocybin access. These healthcare practitioners need access so they can use it in their training. That is the status quo and the standard of training for many therapists, is that they undergo the therapy, or have the opportunity to undergo that therapy before they deliver it to patients, so that they're doing the work. And that's most certainly what's going to make sure that patients are safe in their use of psilocybin, and that the treatment's effective. So I think we've got a lot more to call on our government and to say, start treating this like the maybe a bit more complex situation that it is. Treat it like a drug therapy combination, and listen to the research and listen to the patients and healthcare practitioners who are asking for for change.
Thank you. And with that, we will end the webinar. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. Really appreciate your time, expertise, knowledge, energy, support. Thank you to everybody who showed up this evening to learn a little bit more about the SAP, the work we do, and how we're going to move forward to a better system in the future. You can follow us on social media at therapsil. On Facebook, it's Therapeutic Psilocybin for Canadians, or go to therapsil.ca for more information, and have a lovely evening. Take care.